A new power had taken control of the Pacific, and Japan was facing the largest naval invasion in human history. Over 140,000 troops in thousands of boats waited just off the coast here. They'd taken island after island on the way here, and even though the military had fought to the last man, the enemy was undeterred. They were coming. And what's more, they were coming in overwhelming numbers with improved technology. It was clear that Japan was going to fall. For the first time in history, the Japanese mainland was going to be invaded. They had one hope remaining: the Kamikaze. That story probably sounds familiar. It's the end of World War II, right? Well, sort of. This story actually takes place in the 13th century, and the invaders are Mongolian. And there's a couple of things that I should point out straight away. The first is that when I say the Mongolians, I actually mean the Yuan dynasty of China, headed by Kublai Khan. It is now no longer just a steppe people, but a massive expansionist empire taking over all of what we would consider modern-day China and Korea, taking more countries every year. And in addition to that, they aren't really the barbarian horsemen that you might imagine. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that Kublai Khan was one of the most intelligent and modernizing leaders of human history. He's kind of like China's Augustus. But to the Japanese, he was a great threat. And in 1274, he sent an expeditionary force of 20,000 troops to come and sort of probe the Japanese defenses. The Mongols had never really been that great with ocean travel, so you could almost say that he wanted to test the waters, so to speak. And by all accounts, it was a failure. Even though the Japanese were wholly unprepared for this new Mongolian style of combat, they were still doing one-on-one battles where they would call out an individual and fight them in single combat on the field of battle. The Mongolians didn't do that, they just shot you with an arrow. But yet, they had greater numbers. So they pushed the Mongolians back and held them on the shore. And the Mongolians decided, since they weren't going to be able to take this force, they would head back to China and report on what they'd seen and done. But as they went out in their boats heading back home, a great storm entered the harbor. Despite it being November, over a month after the typhoon season ended, they were swept away by this great storm. And a local Buddhist monk who'd been trying to convert the various lords from Shintoism, he claimed ownership. He said, clearly this wasn't just an accident. This was a divine wind, or as they call it in Japanese, Kamikaze. But the Mongols weren't done with Japan. That first invasion had just been a test, and the real war was coming. Kublai Khan in 1281 sent a new invasion, and it was much bigger than the first. But the Japanese weren't just here twiddling their thumbs. They knew this was coming, and they'd been preparing. They were no longer going to fight in that individual style. They'd even invented a new type of sword called the katana that wouldn't break in the Mongolian leather armor. And they built this wall along the Hakata coast, just tall enough to stop horses from flooding in. But what's more is that they united. Hundreds of previously sparring groups got together to be one major army. And even though they were certainly going to lose, nobody could say that the Japanese would have gone down without a fight. But the Khan was hasty. Sure, he had 4,400 boats, then the largest naval invasive force in history, but the boats looked a lot better on paper than they did in the harbor. Because of that first kamikaze, he hadn't really had time to rebuild an ocean-bound fleet, and as such he'd conscripted a lot of flat-bottom river boats, which are just terrible in ocean waves. What's more, he had two armies. He'd split them in half. One was coming from Korea and the other up from southern China. And the one coming from Korea was only slightly larger than the previous one that had invaded Japan before. But they were hasty as well. The moment that they hit, they invaded, thinking that they could create a vanguard and open a place on the beach for this second army to come in and attack. But they didn't count on the wall. And what they really didn't count on was the unified Japanese response. The Japanese pushed back that initial force before the second had a chance to get up. And being stuck on the beach, they felt it was safer to get back in their boats and head back into the harbor, at which point they'd team up and then invade in full. And there, out in the harbor, preparing for what would have been one of the greatest naval battles of history, a typhoon entered the strait. Between the sinking of the ships and those slaughtered as they swam to shore, the Great Khan lost 80% of his army. Over 100,000 soldiers died. The Kamikaze had returned. Nearly 600 years later, Japan was facing another unstoppable threat. The Second World War had turned and America was coming. They'd tried their best to do a single battle in the Philippines to stop their advance, but they'd lost more pilots that day than they could train in an entire year. What's more, the Imperial Navy was destroyed. They were losing planes at a rate of 10 to 1 with no way to rebuild them. Unable to stop this machine now coming for them, and unwilling to admit defeat or surrender, they asked for a new group of volunteers. They called them the Tokubetsu Kogeikitai, or Special Attack Unit, but that's just a euphemism. They were suicide bombers. But the military government had been telling a near constant lie to the people. It would be a huge shock for them to admit that they'd been stretching the truth about how the war was going. But the people were going to find out sooner or later that bombs were now coming to shore. It was quite clear that the Navy was defeated. Letters from their children were no longer coming home as they once did. And so the propaganda wing of the government-sponsored newspapers, they had to come up with a way to spin this so that it was a positive, or at the very least, hopeful. And so they looked to history, and they said, oh, well, these aren't the last-ditch effort of a failed war. They're the kamikaze. Their spirit can save this nation from invasion once again. But the moral of this story, if there is one, is that you can only stretch a lie so far. It can become codified, historicized, and enter the public consciousness as a fact, but eventually all lies are exposed. And the bigger the lie has become, the more damaging it's going to be once it does collapse. And there's no question that it affected the American soldiers. But it didn't stop them, because there's no such thing as divine wind. The monk who'd invented it did a huge disservice to Japan. In an attempt to convince some lords to change to his religion, he'd inadvertently taught the nation a horrible lesson. That this land couldn't be invaded so long as they kept the faith. And he was wrong. This is Rare Earth. Just waiting for this wind to stop. Big gust right now.